Hello everyone and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First letter. Shock of the Ordinary, 28th of May 2014. I fail to see the connection between the unusual relationship of Louise Pratt and Aram Hosey and the expectation that their baby will enjoy the luck of being utterly loved and utterly wanted. Baby born to bounce, letters 27th of the 5th. Perhaps we could fill a page or two, or even a whole newspaper, with more traditional unions who are striving for this same outcome. Now there's a challenge. Max Vallis, Wembley. Here's the thing. So Louise Pratt is a federal politician from Western Australia. Her partner is a man named Aram Hosey, who is a transgendered individual, so who's transitioned to being man. So Louise Pratt is a lesbian who initially partnered with a woman who transitioned to becoming a man, and now they're having a child. And there was an article in the paper about it, and somebody wrote in saying that it was fantastic that their child would be deeply loved. So the thing that you're missing, Max, is that there is actually good reason to suspect that their child will be deeply loved, and that we've got better reasons for suspecting that than we do with other, more traditional couples, as you'd put it. And that is because people who have a sexuality that is very much in the minority, their lives are under a whole lot more scrutiny, and even self-scrutiny. And so whenever they take a decision, to have children and start a family, they generally do it much more mindful of the pitfalls and problems that they are likely to encounter. And therefore this child is actually in a much better position because of that, and is more likely to be loved than, say, random couple who are having, male and female couple who are having a child. This is the same for children who are adopted, children of couples who are infertile, etc., etc. And if your concern is that, why are we devoting any time to putting this in the newspaper? Why not more traditional families? Well, actually, in any given edition of this newspaper, you'll find many articles about what you would call traditional families. That is actually what what is most common in the media in these days. You only have to look on television and you'll find couple after couple after couple where it's man and a woman. And on the rare occasion that you see something outside of that, you are unlikely to see a lesbian partnership between a woman and a transgendered man. That is so outside of the mainstream that I'm glad that they actually bothered to report it and put it in this. And I'm glad it makes you uncomfortable. And no, it's not some kind of false balance to then try and devote an entire page or two to more traditional unions just so you can feel reassured. Their family is just as much a family as anybody else's, and I'm glad that the newspaper covered it. Next letter. All for Self-Sufficiency, 30th of May 2014. I don't know why people are complaining about the Abbott government budget, because I'm not interested in paying someone else's university fees, nor am I interested in paying sick people's medical bills when they drink to excess, smoke, eat unhealthy foods, use illicit drugs, or fail to exercise. University students used to study in the evening after work, or get to work over their 3-month vacation to fund studies. Can you imagine young people doing that these days? Clive Cooper, London. Yes, I can. And you are obviously out of touch with the younger generation. These days, almost every university student works. Almost all of them will work at part-time throughout semester and during their holidays. And most of them are probably living worse off than you were in your time. Certainly a couple of generations ago, or a generation ago, working during the 3-month break could easily fund you for the rest of the year with a sort of a government stipend to keep you going. Nowadays, that's not possible at all. So many more students are having to live at home these days because they can't afford to move out, which was, a generation ago it was fairly standard that people would move out of home when they went to university. Now that's actually much more exceptional because people simply can't afford it. And the idea that, yes, you're not interested in supporting other people in society as long as they don't conform to your moral expectations, thankfully that's not the way that our society works. That you don't get to impose your morality on people unitarily and decide whether or not to pay taxes based on the perceived worthiness to you of the people who are receiving the benefits. And you should be interested in paying people's medical bills and university fees through your taxation, because that is actually what builds a safe and stable and happy society, which is the kind of society that most people want to live in. And if you don't want to live in a society like that, simply look around the world at other societies where people are not paying medical bills and not paying the university fees of other people. And you will see that these are societies that are generally compare much, much worse to our society. Part of the greatness of our society is built on the fact that we do look after each other. So there. Next letter. Opening up money, 30th of May 2014. Hang on. Didn't federal Labor spend $16.2 billion on the program Building the Education Revolution? This equated to an average of about $1.7 million for every school in the country. So they all got shiny new halls whether they needed them or not. But the essential stuff wasn't touched. Could it have been just another Labor program that was misdirected, poorly administered, and returned inadequate bang for buck? Bruce Waddle, Bayswater. Yes, so the actual problem, the one true problem with the Building the Education Revolution program was that its naming of it and the selling of it was really just a PR exercise. So Labor, when they brought it in, decided that they were going to use it they were going to pretend that this spending really was all central to education, and that's what the sole purpose of the program was. And if you judge it based on its PR, then yes, it was misdirected, poorly administered, and returned inadequate bang for buck. The thing was, that actually wasn't the true intent of the program, and many people at the time did speak up about actually what the program was designed to do. And really what it was that the world was struggling in the midst of the global financial crisis, economies were tanking around the world, and in particular Australia's economy was looking like it was going to go into recession. The government realised that, what would be prudent at this point would be to do a large expenditure program. So the government wanted to pump funds into the economy, and a big part of their focus was they wanted to keep people in jobs. So the idea was to pump, this was $16 billion, there was actually a whole pile more that was spent, but they wanted to pump this $16 billion into the economy to keep people in jobs. And the idea was that the research was showing, or the experts were suggesting, that one of the hardest hit areas during the global financial crisis were things like construction. And so we were at risk of having a whole pile of construction workers out of work. The other problem with that is a lot of people who work in construction are unskilled at working in other fields, and so they're not likely to be able to transition easily into other industries. So when the construction industry goes belly up, even on a relatively short-term basis, we're looking at people who don't necessarily have a lot of savings, generally on the poorer end, on the sort of less educated end of the scale, or the lower on the socioeconomic status, and don't have a lot of transferable skills. And so the government decided they needed to support this industry. They tied that to their traditional Labor heartland of education, because they realised that this would make good PR and make Liberals look bad in response. Basically Labor's whole PR thing is, focus on education, and because the Liberals always look bad. So the intention then was to spend this $16 billion quick smart on building things. And because for the PR benefit, the idea was to build school halls, essentially, and other infrastructure on schools. And that's exactly what they did. So they looked for projects that had already basically been designed and were ready to go but hadn't been funded. And they just pumped this money into it. Sometimes schools didn't have plans to build halls or other sort of facilities like that. And so essentially cookie cutter designs were, come up with very quickly, and, the school would get a new hall. And you're right, a lot of these schools didn't necessarily need these. These weren't the things that they necessarily wanted. But the actual purpose of the Building the Education Revolution was actually to support the construction industry and a whole range of related industries around that. And at that, it was actually a really astounding success. Because it had to be short-term, because we're looking at short-term stimulus, and the money had to be spent quickly, it couldn't be budgeted off into the future. And so, yes, sometimes these things that were built were not particularly useful from an educational point of view, but they were incredibly useful from an economic point of view. And they kept our economy bubbling over nicely. They kept a lot of people in jobs, and they kept a whole industry going. So if they hadn't branded it as a Building Education Revolution, and instead had branded it as, supporting the construction industry, you would perhaps have a better opinion of it. Next letter. Why we're going broke, 30th of May 2014. Like many, I can remember the cost of a loaf of bread being 40 cents. Why does it now cost $4? It is produced with the same ingredients, but more efficient machinery, even more efficient farming, all of which could have lowered the cost. What is sending us to the wall is the legacy of a past government influenced by unionists who need to justify their well-paid positions and create an I want more mentality, raising the cost of our labour and leaving us into a false sense of entitlement. 43% of Australians now take more than they give. How's that for sustainability? It's time for the whinging to stop. The party's over. Every Australian must pitch in and help clean up the financial mess. Barry Kramer, Bayswater. Well, Barry, so there's quite a bit in your letter. First of all, yes. So, doing a bit of research, the last time that bread was around 40 cents, as far as I can tell, was about 1970. You say it's now about $4, which is probably about right, depending on what kind of bread you're buying. You can get it about half that price. You can get it about twice the price, depending on what you want to buy. The interesting thing is, so from 1971 to 2013, which is the years I can get figures on, we're looking at a rough increase of a 40-cent loaf of bread to a $4 loaf of bread. And that's approximately 42 years. Now, in those same 42 years, so what's happened is we've had a tenfold increase in the cost of bread, or I was actually using the Consumer Price Index, which is a better measure of things. So we've had about a tenfold increase in CPI. In that same time, average wages has gone from about $4,000 a year to about $75,000 a year, which means we've had about a 17-fold increase in wages. What that means is the average person is earning 17 times as much, but they're spending only 10 times as much, which means that we're all actually ahead. So actually a $4 loaf of bread at the moment is not equivalent to a 40-cent loaf of bread back then in terms of affordability. It's actually about almost half that. Which means that we're all actually much better off. And this is actually quite obvious if you think about the quality of life. So nowadays, in 1970, people would have had one television and one car. They would have had a 2 or 3 bedroom house maybe. Nowadays, an average family has 2 cars, has got 2 or 3 televisions, an iPad, a couple of mobile phones each, a mobile phone for each adult, and probably a 3 or 4 bedroom house in the suburbs. Owning a pool is maybe a little bit out of reach for the average family, but only just. Whereas back in 1970, that was a luxury that only the richest people could afford. And so actually our standard of living has gone way out in front. Now, the point about unionists is this, that over that time, essentially what's happened is the rich have gotten richer. And the unionist argument has always been that the working class folk at the bottom of the tree, generally, that their standard of living should increase at roughly the same rate as everybody else's. And so that when there is inflation in wages, that should flow down to the poorest of people and people at the bottom of the tree. And that all people's wages should basically go up at the same sorts of rates. And this has created the sense of entitlement, but not a false sense of entitlement, a sense of entitlement that, the economic growth in this country should be shared amongst all people. That's hardly a false entitlement. That's probably exactly the right entitlement. Now, if you want to talk about false entitlement, I would absolutely agree with you that in the last 20 odd years in Australian politics, there has grown a sense of entitlement that the middle class, that is people who are not struggling, are somehow entitled to government assistance for a whole range of things, like that the government should help them with the cost of private health cover, that the government should help them with the cost of childcare, that the government should help them with the costs of having a child, that the government should somehow pay out money to help them buy school books. All of these kind of things were primarily introduced during the Howard years of the right-wing Liberal government, and continued obviously under Labor because they weren't strong enough to actually do something about that. And yes, that has created a sense of entitlement, and yes, that has bumped it up to about 43% of Australians who now are net recipients of government welfare. And I think that is stupid, and the party should be over. But what we should do is essentially come up with a reasonable thing and say, the bottom 25% of Australians should receive government assistance, and it's the people above that who should have their assistance cut, not the people below it. The people below it are still struggling. I mean, the poorest in our society are still doing it tough compared to the rest of us. And so if you want to reduce the amount of government spending and government support, you should look at the people who are in the top half of that 43%, and even above that who are receiving financial assistance. And they're the ones that we should cut the government's funding to. Others more worthy, 3rd of June 2014. Premier Colin Barnett can't help himself from making the wrong decisions this year. The naming of a permanent square after Yahan is another one. Yahan's history is well described by noted historian Sir Paul Hasluck, printed in the West Australian years ago. It presents a picture of a man not worthy of such an honour. Surely there are other notables more deserving. Hendrik Smit, Perth. Okay, so those of you who aren't from WA and haven't been following the news and don't really know much about it, Yahan was a Aboriginal man of the Noongar tribe here in southwest Western Australia, who fought against the colonial occupiers when they first came to Western Australia. So about 200 years ago, white settlers established the Swan River Colony, which has now become Perth. And while it wasn't an out-and-out invasion, some Aboriginal groups at the time definitely saw it that way. Others were more accepting of white settlers. And it really came down to a difference in cultural approaches to land use. So the white settlers assumed, quite wrongly, that the Aboriginal people were nomads and didn't have any ties to particular parts of the land. This is quite wrong. The weather and the climate in WA was such that they had cyclical movements, so that different parts of their land would be able to support them at different times of the year. So they would move, but they would only move within sort of the boundaries of their land, as it were. So what happened was white settlers came out here and established a colony, and for a while there, a lot of the Aboriginal tribes were quite happy doing trade and whatever, and were quite amiable. But as white settlers began to take away sacred sites and fence them off and use them for farming, the Aboriginal people actually used fire as a way of hunting and as part of land thing, and that came into conflict definitely with the white settlers. So there was actually a lot of conflict. Also, at the time, Aboriginal people were generally treated as nothing but animals. They were not actually seen as people by a lot of the colonists. They were seen as being part of the fauna of the country. And so would routinely be culled from people's lands. That is, white people would go out with guns and just shoot Aboriginal people who happened to be on their land. And this was not seen as any kind of crime. This was seen as just culling. This is a despicable part of our history. Now, in response to this, several Aboriginal people and lots of Aboriginal people saw this as an invasion of their land and saw themselves as freedom fighters who were resisting this foreign invasion. And yeah, they killed people. And sometimes they killed people with what we would see as no provocation. Part of the Aboriginal law was that if one person in your tribe was killed by somebody from another tribe, that the reasonable and fair punishment was to kill somebody of the rival tribe. It didn't have to be the person who did the killing. Tribes were seen as, or family groupings were seen as basically being representative of each other. So if a member of your family had unlawfully killed somebody from another family, that any member of your family could be killed in retribution, and that was considered perfectly acceptable. And so when an Aboriginal person may have been shot and killed by a white farmer, the Aboriginal people would retaliate by killing one of their family or their servants or something like that. And the white settlers saw this as horrendous murder and hardly just to take it out on somebody else. This was well within keeping of the Aboriginal people, whose land it was. We had no treaty with them. We didn't even treat them as a civilization. And so we didn't make any kind of treaty. We didn't make any attempt to buy the land from them because we generally saw them as animals and not to be treated with anything. So, Yahan in particular murdered a couple of people. He was, he killed several people actually. He was captured. They tried to, he was punished for a while there. He was put in an island prison. They tried to convert him to Christianity. He escaped. He killed a few more white settlers in retribution for Aboriginal deaths, and eventually he was killed. There was a bounty placed on him and he was killed. His head was then severed from his corpse as proof of the bounty. The head was then smoked to preserve it, and it was sent to Liverpool, the other side of the world, where it was put in a museum as a sort of as some kind of curiosity to be looked at. And then in about 1964, I believe, the museum got tired of the head and buried it, just randomly. Of note, in 1964, when they did this, Aboriginal people did not have the right to vote in all jurisdictions in Australia. So we were still treating them largely as animals, and at that point they weren't counted in the census either, because they were considered part of the fauna of the land, not as people. Then there was a campaign to get Yagan's head repatriated, which culminated in it actually finally being returned. And so the other factor going on here is that the white settlers, the European settlers, won the battle. We invaded, we took the land, and we made it our own. And we have all the written history. So the history is written by the victors, but in this case, the Aboriginal culture did not have a written history. They did not have a written language, and so they have no written records from the time. Also, since colonisation, there have been repeated and deliberate and intergenerational attempts by Australian governments to eradicate Aboriginal culture, which means that we essentially have no records from the time, from the Aboriginal people of the time. All we have is the white European records of what happened. And so, yes, the picture we have painted of people like Yagan is of them as being uncivilized barbarian murderers. That's certainly not true, because the people making these records are entirely biased, and we don't have any records from the other side. And secondly, it doesn't matter, because most people don't know their history at all, and most people who celebrate Yagan don't really care what he did 200 years ago. What it is a big sign of is the fight for Indigenous recognition in WA, the fight to get them recognised as people, to get voting rights, to have any kind of their culture recognised as being significant and important to West Australians. And so absolutely we should name things after him. Now, there's been many letters on this. There was another letter from an Aboriginal person saying that it's absolutely appalling that they're naming a small square after him that's right next door to King Square. And I actually agree with that completely. I mean, I think that Colin Barnett simply, the Premier, deciding to name it after Yagan with no consultation of the Aboriginal community is absolutely stupid. The Aboriginal community should have had the grand amount of say in naming these things. And secondly, yeah, you should certainly consider the context in which it's placed. And you shouldn't certainly not be placing, naming a landmark that is right next door to a landmark that's named after the monarch, King Square. It's absolutely stupid. But I think that, yes, we should be making a conscious and massive effort to name things in Western Australia after the original inhabitants and the longest continuous civilization on the planet. We should absolutely be looking for opportunities to recognise Aboriginal people and their contribution to our country. And yes, he fought against us, and he was damn right in doing that and fighting against white settlers. Now, I'm not saying that white settlers deserve to be murdered and killed, but neither did Aboriginal people. And that was our treatment of Aboriginal people is a stain on our national history that is actually still there. It's not even like we've stopped doing it, as treatment has gotten to the point where we can be happy with it. This was a shameful things that we've done as a people and as a country, and absolutely we should look for ways to redress that. Anyway, I feel better after that rant. I hope you're all having a good week, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. Bye.